In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on subject and object relations. But before I get into subject-object relations, it's always important and meaningful to begin any discussion of subject-object relations with subjective-objective relationships. And whenever we're talking about subjective-objective relationships, we have to well define specific what we mean by subjective-objective relationships, and they pertain to mind-body connections. And when we're talking about subject-object relationships, we always have to also talk about definitions of what subjective is and also what objective is and what they mean. And to do this, the best way is to actually start with a definition of subjectivity to get to a good definition of what subjective is. And subjectivity pertains to our direct perception in regards to the subject matter contents that stream through our consciousness and which are unique to us as individual thinkers who have free agency, and we're individualized in our agency and our conduct. And so what we experience in regards to our feelings or meaningful emotions is going to be different than other people. And it's going to be unique to us as an individual, and it can't ever actually be the same as others, but it can be meaningfully similar. And often how we can actually get to what's objective is through being able to see where there's accordances and concordance rates between what's most meaningfully similar, and what allows us to constitute the validations for valid, psychologically true, and meaningful truths of existence that tend to be more universalizable and universal, and which have these objective properties in which we can find quite ubiquitously. And ubiquitous means that it's pretty much everywhere in regards to that specific property or that domain-specific operating domain of operation. And when we're trying to understand what subjective is, it's pertains to our subjectivity, and it regards our direct perception that's unique to us and not the same as another individual, in which we have our own different meanings and meaning interpretations. And meaning interpretation is always subjective, but we can increase the objectivity of meaning interpretations, and that allows us to obtain objective truth and also develop true knowledge in regards to what's more true and what moves from just being a mere subjective thought, in which to actually be a subjective thought has to constitute at least subjective truth. And if it were to purely be subjective, it would be nonsense, meaningless. And if we're just experiencing pure subjectivity, this is, could be that you have taken a psychedelic substance, perhaps, so that you're not in the right state of mind, and so it's not a mental disorder. But in any other case, it's a good sign that it's probably quite a serious psychiatric disorder or mental disorder if you're experiencing just purely subjective processes, because we need to have some sort of objectivity to our direct perception to be able to conduct ourselves in any meaningful regard at all. And so anytime you're having a thought, and for it to be an actual thought rather than perceived as a thought or just thought as a thought, it has to have some form of subjective-objective relationship, and that's connecting the mind to the body. And from this, we can get to the subject matter of thoughts, and so we can start to understand what subject and object might be in regards to that. A subject being the meaningful information that's operating within subjective experiences of our direct perception, and which regards our subjectivity, but also can also pertain to objective truths as we're discussing particular subjects in regards to subject matter that have been originally instantiated by other individuals with well-defined prior existing knowledge that exists in regards to meaningful properties that as a must be good enough and necessary conditions to constitute existing properties that have been associated to our meaning interpretations, well calibrated, not necessarily just from aesthetic properties, but tend to be preliminarily sourcing meaningful information from what are objective properties and the subcomponent processes that come from component parts and processes. And this might be a little bit more complicated, and I started with subcomponent there quite intentionally, and I'm doing so meaningfully because especially if you're more interested in being able to well define anything meaningfully, instead of sticking with a vague term, it's important to engage more of this objective thinking, which requires us to actually perceive from the component parts and processes, the more subcomponent parts and processes. And the subcomponent parts tend to be what constitutes the objective. And if we think about how we go about formulating any form of meaningful utterance of thought in regards to psychological truths, we start with propositions that are composed of subpropositions, and those subpropositions must have at least and only two infinite combinatory meaning interpretations, but which are posited as meaningful words that we can combine to be able to compose any proposition, which composes our true statements. So, for example, some meaning. And some meaning has an infinite range of propositions that can be composed from those sub-propositions, and only two of them. And when we're trying to think about meaningful emotions, here's another two propositions: meaning and mind. And if you think about, okay, well, if emotions are bound, say, to the body, how come there isn't body there? Well, for us to actually be able to constitute any meaning, we have to get through the mind to the body. And so we need to be able to get from mind to body. And mind is the most good enough and necessarily necessary condition to be able to do that. And meaning is necessary for you to be able to constitute the category and categorical processes to be able to constitute direct perception that's meaningful enough to be able to constitute an emotion. And especially as you're learning anything and anything meaningful, engaging in meaningful learns, we have to start with mind, and we don't really have a deep knowledge of the body, and we have a better meaning interpretations of what emotions are. And we typically start with those two categoricals of meaningful information that have those depths of meaning interpretation. So you can get to mind and body from the mind, but you can't necessarily get from body to mind. And this is quite evident for anybody who's studied neuroscience, because neuroscience can be very, very difficult to understand because it's reversing what's not intuitive to us as human beings, or even any sort of animal, because we're doing something in which we're able to abstract out the causations of the body that are indirect to our experience. And we can reverse that ordering of cause and effect to be able to understand how there could be causations that are caused from bodily processes, dynamical bodily processes that influence the mind, but that are ultimately always dynamically mind caused in regards to the causations of direct perceptions, in which we're able to even philosophize any sort of neuroscientific philosophy and constitute any sort of meaningful neuroscience. So we have to be able to create propositions composed of sub-propositions that formulate the true statements that are valid, psychologically true, and meaningful only through the conductives of mind. And we can't actually be able to meaningfully constitute any sort of even neuroscientific paradigm in which we can explore anything without the causations of direct perception that are operating through those propositions composed of sub-propositions that are formulating the meaningful utterances of thought that composition the true statements as we meaningfully engage meaningful utterances, outputting prior existing inputs of internalized communication that require a deeper philosophizing and meaningfulness process to be able to articulate ourselves. And when we're trying to understand subject-object relationships, again, it's important to have a good definition, a well-defined access to knowledge regarding what subjectivity means, what subjective means, and what objective means. And I've somewhat alluded to what objective means here. Objective regards what's actually, factually, really true and meaningful as a must be good enough and necessarily necessary conditions, propositions composed of subpropositions that are compositioning true statements, regard the meaningful properties bound to properties that can be composed and which are preliminarily composed of objective properties that are connecting the mind and body connections to often aesthetic experiences in which we're drawing our prior existing knowledge from, and we need those existing priors to be able to meaningfully constitute knowledge that's objective and objectively true. And that's a good, well-defined, meaningful utterance of thought outputted into the external surrounding environment regarding what objective is. And to be able to understand what subject and object relations are, very much similar here. It pertains to the subject matter of our thoughts, so the words that we use, in which have particular categoricalizations in regards to our learning, and that's the depth in which we can access knowledge in regards to meaning interpretation that has been well calibrated to the words that we utter. And the meaningful utterances of thought, which have specific modelings of meaningful information from our direct sensory experiences, in which we, as a must, good enough, and necessarily necessary conditions, process through direct perceptions and direct perceptual processes that are perspectival. And so there's a depth to that. And that depth allows us to be able to meaningfully engage rather than meaninglessly arbitrary and on absurdities of existence, the boundness that is situated to the existence of the meaningfulness operating within the subject matter words, in which we also are calibrating to learning materials in the surrounding environment. And so there are objects, and those objects pertain to these substances in which we interact through the self and surroundings, and which we tend to navigate the surrounding world meaningfully. And objects are not necessarily parts of the self, but they're something that we can directly perceive through processes, component processes that are able to process meaningful information. Direct perception navigates in regards to component parts and processes that are parsed from the self and surrounds and the external environment. Though before I say that all objects are something that, say, tend to be external, they're not completely external. We tend to have, if you are even different body parts, right? Those are component parts. Those have object characteristics to them. But we typically do not think of ourselves, and it's not always so meaningful to think about ourselves in terms of being objects, right? It's important to also think of us as being mind bodies, and that have these subjective-objective relationships and are not just objects, but have to have these subject-object relationship existing priors before we can get to that subject and object relations. And subject-object relations are important for deepening our word categoricals and categorical knowledge that we get through learning processes, self-directed learning processes preliminarily, that are able to deepen those categorizations of categorical meanings. And all meaningful learning, as a must, good enough, and necessarily necessary conditions, constitute the meaningfulness dentro específico, well-defined rather than vague, meaningful categorical processes. And that's the deepening of meaningful information with regards to a word that allows us to access the boundness to the situatedness of existence regarding specific meaning interpretations that tend to be more objective. And on that continuum of subject-object relationships, subjectivo-objectivo relationships can piece together the subject in relation to subject matter of meaningful utterances of thought, in which we're well calibrated to specific object properties, and even can be, in some cases, which is a little bit more difficult, and this is going back to that subcomponents construct the component processes, whole categories of meaningful information that have been categorized into the correct categoricalization process, and which are not merely arbitrary, absurd, meaningless category, and which require more than just a categorizing process. So anybody who's telling you it's just a categorizing process, they're wrong. And it's correct to actually engage that categoricalization process of meaningful information, because that's what constitutes from the constituent parts and processes the subpropositions that constitute valid, psychologically true, and meaningful propositions of truth statements that we need to be able to well define any sort of meaningful categorical of meaningful information as is being processed within constitute knowledge and meaningful information that we're essentially consuming as we're engaging in meaningful information consumption processes of knowledge, in which we can start to meaningfully understand in meaning interpretation subject and object relations. And that's all I want to say for this video. I hope you have an awesome one and deepen your meaningfulnesses.